Hello, my name is Pedro Feitoza, and I'm very pleased and honored to be speaking at this conference on the history of Latin American evangelicalism. And I'm very thankful to David Babington for the invitation to. I'm speaking from the city of São Paulo, so if you hear the noise of cars, buses, or motorcycles in the background, like this one, it is just the inescapable movement of the city, really. The literary, theological, and intellectual production of American evangelicals before the 1950s is often dismissed by scholars as imitative, conservative, and out of touch with the pressing social realities of the continent. Influential commentators, writing in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, have depicted the writings of the first generations of missionaries, local ministers, and converts as expressions of the dogmatism and defensiveness of North American conservative theology. Some of them have tried to identify the specific moments in which Latin American Protestants abandoned their dependence on Anglophone fundamentalism. For the theologian and educator Rubem Alves, for instance, this process started in the 1950s when ministers and foreign missionaries began to deploy categories of analysis arising from Weberian and Marxist sociology. Others located this intellectual transformation in the 1930s and 40s when pastors and theology professors began to embrace German theology in Brazil. In the Brazilian case, however, converts, ministers, and foreign missionaries started to engage with the religious, social, and political issues of their age from the very beginnings of the Protestant missionary enterprise in the country in the mid-19th century. At least since the late 1850s, converts began to discuss the consequences of their status as a religious minority in Brazil, debating the legitimacy of their evangelistic efforts. But they did so through the religious, social, and political vocabulary characteristic of their own context. In this presentation, I will examine two specific ways by which Brazilian evangelicals intervened in the public debates of their country in the first decades of the 20th century. First, the paper will look at the historiographical work of Brazilian evangelicals, discussing their attempts to create or invent a deep Protestant past that served to legitimize their missionary efforts in modern Brazil. In the second part, I will focus on two Presbyterian ministers and their involvement in debates on racial difference and social change. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the consolidation of a world system of nation-states reshaped modern religious sensibilities. Nationalist politicians and intellectuals questioned the civil loyalty of religious minorities in different parts of the world. Ultramontane Catholics in 19th century Britain, for example, were accused of being disloyal to the monarchy, and conversion to Christianity in India and China was often deemed anti-national. In early 20th century Brazil, evangelicals were amongst these embattled religious minorities. Conservative Catholics and nationalist writers objected to the expansion of evangelical propaganda in Brazil based on a number of reasons. First, Catholic polemists such as the fathers Agnello Rossi and Leonel Franca argued that the Reformation broke away with the unity of Christendom and that its modern missionary endeavor fragmented the unity of the Brazilian nation. Second, they claimed that evangelical Christianity waged war against the hierarchy and authority of the Catholic Church, disaggregating its ecclesiastical organization and sowing the seeds of anarchy. Finally, nationalist writers and Catholic clergymen viewed the evangelical missionary enterprise in Brazil as a tool of North American imperialism, a soft instrument of cultural and ideological penetration in the country. In the face of such set of accusations, it was common for Christian minorities to advocate the historical rootedness of their religion. So, 19th century Bengali writers discussed historical evidence of St. Thomas's travel to India in order to situate their religious communities into a longer historical line that could be traced back to the Apostolic Age. And Yoruba Christians in Africa built upon Orisha religion and the prophecies of Babalawos to claim that Yoruba rites and beliefs prefigured the advent of Christianity in West Africa. Brazilian evangelicals resorted to similar strategies in their attempts to assert the historical antiquity of Protestantism in the country. They sought to demonstrate that their religion was not alien to the national soul by locating Protestantism into the depths of Brazilian history. This move started in the mid-19th century when Methodist missionary Daniel Kidder and Presbyterian chaplain James Fletcher recovered the history of the invasion of French Calvinists in Rio de Janeiro in the 16th century in their book Brazil and the Brazilians, which was a sort of bestseller on Brazil in the United States. Kidder and Fletcher emphasized that it was on the Guanabara Bay, that iconic site in Rio de Janeiro, that French Huguenots celebrated the first communion in the Americas, preceding the arrival of the English Puritans to America by nearly 70 years. 12 years after the establishment of the French settlement, the Portuguese reconquered the Rio de Janeiro area and dissolved the colony. Kidder and Fletcher attributed the failure of this Calvinist invasion to Catholic intolerance and the cynicism of Nicolas de Villegagnon, the founder of the settlement, who later collided with the Calvinists. Decades later, in the midst of a series of celebrations of historical events that shaped Brazilian and world history, Protestant ministers and writers carried further this historical anchorage of evangelical Christianity into the Brazilian past. In 1896, city councillors and other political leaders in São Paulo planned to erect a statue in praise of one of the founders of the city, the Jesuit priest José de Anchieta. The Presbyterian pastor Álvaro Reis objected vehemently to this. In tracts addressed to both the governor of São Paulo and the general public, Reis depicted Father Anchieta as a violent, intolerant, and uneducated priest who presided over the execution of one of the survivors of the French colony, the Calvinist Jean de Baylor. One of Álvaro Reis' central claims was that Anchieta and the Jesuits more broadly stood against both the values of the newborn Brazilian Republic and the tolerant and progressive spirit of his age. For him, the specter of Jesuitism was inevitably opposed to the progress of the nation. It was in 1900, however, that the most elaborate evangelical interpretation of Brazilian history appeared. To commemorate the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Portuguese in Brazil, an association of scientists and writers edited a collection of 3 monumental volumes examining various aspects of Brazilian history over the past 4 centuries. The book on Catholicism, written by the prominent priest Júlio Maria, stressed the pivotal role of the Catholic Church in the construction of a sense of Brazilianness. For him, for Júlio Maria, the Jesuits and their missionary enterprise cemented the unity of the nation both symbolically and effectively. The response came from the influential Protestant journalist José Carlos Rodrigues in his 300-page book titled Non-Catholic Religions in Brazil, which was also included in the collection. For Rodrigues, Portuguese and Catholic rule degenerated into moral and economic decadence in the colonial period, and the actions of the Inquisition in Portugal and Brazil dissolved harmonious social and family relations in the colony. Drawing from historical records kept in his vast personal library, Rodrigues reconstructed in detail the histories and individual trajectories of those 16th century French Calvinists who settled in Rio de Janeiro, and also the Reformed Dutch who invaded the region of Pernambuco in Brazil in the following century. In spite of the Portuguese recovery of these invaded territories and the ensuing religious persecution, Rodrigues claimed that Protestantism lived on in the country, penetrating some indigenous tribes that had only intermittent contact with the Portuguese. Like Álvaro Reis, Rodrigues also argued that the intolerance and violence associated with the actions of Catholic priests were antithetical to the Republican spirit and the improvement of Brazilian society. For Brazilian Protestants, evangelical Christianity produced psychological and behavioral impulses that favored diligence and industry. According to Rodrigues' argument, in driving out the economically dynamic Protestants and Jews, Jesuit intolerance shattered the progress of Brazilian society. Besides linking evangelical Christianity to the origins of their nation, Brazilian Protestants also attempted to locate these historical experiences into the transnational circuits of the Reformation in the 16th century. In 1917, when the Brazilian congregations commemorated 400 years of the beginning of the Reformation, two publications located the deaths of the French Huguenots in Rio de Janeiro into the lists of martyrs of the Reformation alongside Thomas Cranmer, Hugh Latimer, and others. The first of these tracts was an account written by an elder of the Presbyterian Church of Rio de Janeiro of the deeds and deaths of 3 French Protestant ministers in Rio de Janeiro. The last part of this tract included the so-called Guanabara Faith Confession, a document written by 4 French Calvinist ministers and translated into Portuguese by the Presbyterian pastor and educator Erasmo Braga. In the tract, the French Protestants were depicted as proto-martyrs of evangelical Christianity in Brazil, whose actions prefigured the advance of Protestantism in the country centuries later. The second text was a short book published by the Independent Presbyterian Church of São Paulo. The church's founder, the leading pastor and grammarian Eduardo Carlos Pereira, situated the martyrdom of the French Calvinists into the carnage characteristic of the Reformation. By recovering such histories in the early 20th century, Brazilian Protestants hit 2 birds with 1 stone. On the one hand, they built a narrative that emphasized the antiquity and ubiquity of Catholic violence in Brazilian and world history. On the other, they dismissed nationalist objections to the missionary propaganda in Brazil, claiming that their evangelistic enterprise was instead the continuation of an older endeavor. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, Protestants also engaged with debates about racial difference and social change circulating in Brazil. In the period ranging from 1870 to 1940, theories of racial difference and their variations became nearly ubiquitous explanations for Brazil's backwardness and prospects for the future. This was a period in which ethnologists and physical anthropologists believed that insurmountable differences separated the various human races of the world, and in which social Darwinists claimed that the superior races would eventually triumph. For the Brazilian intelligentsia, who lived in the last country of the Americas to abolish slavery and in a highly miscegenated society, these indictments were especially agonizing. Physicians and anthropologists held negative views of miscegenation, claiming that racial mixture would condemn Brazil to permanent inferiority. Men of letters, on the other hand, sought to counter such pessimism by claiming that racial fusion would eventually whiten Brazilian society, enabling its modernization. Despite the relative optimism or pessimism of the country's intellectual elites, the assumption that racial difference determined the fate of societies was there, shaping conceptions of modernity. Brazilian Protestants, however, held theories of racial difference in suspicion. Mission theorists in the 19th and 20th centuries upheld the principle of the unity of mankind, in contrast to their contemporary physical anthropologists who believed that human races had different origins. Foreign missionaries and Brazilian ministers conceived conversion and education as the 2 main drivers of individual and social improvement, replacing the dictates of racial and environmental determinism by a loosely defined religious determinism. The most influential writing that shaped evangelical conceptions of race came from Émile de Lavallée, a Catholic Belgian economist. His tract, titled The Future of Catholic Peoples, was translated into Portuguese and published by the Presbyterians in Rio de Janeiro in 1875. Lavallée's central argument advocated that Protestantism nourished positive attitudes towards education, trade, agriculture, and the arts, whereas Catholic societies degenerated into despotism and ignorance. For him, instead of race, it was worship that determined the development of Anglo-Saxon and German societies and the backwardness of Latin countries. Lavallée's arguments exerted a profound impact on Brazilian Protestant ministers in the first decades of the 20th century. The Reverend Erasmo Braga, for instance, referred to what he called Lavallée's law when claiming that to properly explain the differences between the Anglo-Saxon and the Latin races of the Americas, one should pay attention to their historical and religious difference instead of ethnic factors. It was Eduardo Pereira, though, who proposed a comprehensive, provocative evaluation of the concept of race. He did it in his long book, The Religious Problem of Latin America, published in 1920, and partly based on his analysis of the significance of the Panama Congress of 1916 to the Latin American religious landscape. The Panama Congress was the first and most important of those early 20th century missionary conferences dedicated to study the situation of the missionary work in Latin America. It was a direct offspring of the World Missionary Conference of 1910 in Edinburgh. Like Braga, Pereira also acknowledged the importance of Lavallée's arguments, claiming that the scientific method validated his explanation of the decadence of Latin peoples. But Pereira went further, propounding a wide-ranging interpretation of Christian universalism to counter scientific racism. For him, the concept of race was anthropologically uncertain and historically confused, whereas the common origin of humankind was firmly established in the realm of science. Building upon the scientific confidence of the era, Pereira claimed that Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory showed unequivocally that mankind had a common biological origin, and nothing could oppose the idea, quote, that all human races were conceived as varieties of one only primitive family headed by the biblical patriarch, end of quote. Ever since Darwin's theory was articulated, quote again, the polygenism of the human species must have entered into a coma, and contemporary science, hand in hand with Christian religion, proclaimed the fraternity of all races, the original equality of all branches of the human family. In fact, there is no absolute physiological and psychological distinction between the various ethnic groupings that we call races. In the individuals of all of them, there are the same organs and functions, the same moral and intellectual faculties, the same thoughts and essential sentiments, end of quote. It was also in the Panama Congress of 1916 that Brazilian Protestants came into direct contact with the social gospel. One of the speakers at the conference was the American Methodist Bishop Francis Mcconnell, a leading exponent of the social gospel in the United States. In his address, Mcconnell claimed that the wars between science and religion that shaped the 19th century religious experience gave way to reconciliation in the early 20th century. The bishop invited his brethren to build upon this reciprocity between science and Christianity and overcome the forces of poverty and hunger, alleviating the anxiety of mankind in his age of war and industrialization. Francis Mcconnell's address exerted a profound impact on some Latin American participants at the Panama Congress. In the Brazilian context, the Presbyterian pastor Erasmo Braga became the key advocate of the principles of the social gospel. In contrast to the majority of his contemporaries, Braga did not ascribe the social problems of his country to the cultural influence of Catholicism alone. For him, what justified the missionary enterprise in Brazil was a number of social problems, especially high levels of illiteracy, the outbreaks of malaria and tuberculosis, popular addiction to cachaça, a sort of white rum, and the socially disaggregating effects of rapid industrialization. In a remarkable passage of his report of the Panama Congress, Braga claimed that it was in the domestic intimacy of evangelical families that one could best perceive the transformations of the vivifying energy of the gospel. Conversion to Protestantism reshaped their sexual hygiene, fostered movements for fair work relations, and conducted converts into electoral honesty. Erasmo Braga best showed his commitment to the social gospel in a conference on comparative religions in Rio de Janeiro in 1928. His long address asserted that the movement of reversion to primitive Christianity, which animated both the 16th century reformers and contemporary Protestants, transformed them in one of the greatest elements of culture in their generation, for they sought to make the scriptures accessible to all social classes. In it, he also explained the meaning of Protestant individualism. It was a process of self-discovery and moral liberation by which converts reconciled their consciousness with God, a transformation that produced incoercible individuals who did not compromise their renewed conscience under surrounding moral pressures. This individualism projected itself into social life as converts expressed their unease with present-day iniquities, including the industrialization of human relations, the distance between capital and work, class and racial conflicts, and the strong nationalisms of the interwar era. Braga argued that only a united body of committed Christians could combine efforts on a global scale and Christianize the social order. And here he acknowledged his debts to exponents of the social gospel, including Walter Rauschenbusch, Johann Blumhardt, and Francis Mcconnell. Erasmo Braga's appropriation of the social gospel coincided with the rise of anti-alcohol and sanitation campaigns in urban Brazil in the 1910s. In other writings, Braga expressed his enthusiasm for such campaigns, describing advances in public health and temperance as signs of the expansion of the kingdom of God. Evangelical concerns with hygiene and sobriety, then, were by no means simple expressions of moral conservatism or signs of a lack of a social ethic, as some scholars have argued. They merged together international theological discourses and locally specific social and political secular concerns. With this presentation, I have attempted to show how Brazilian evangelical ministers and writers mobilized and built upon a wide repertoire of intellectual and theological traditions to engage with the public debates of their age. These Brazilian Protestants recovered long-forgotten histories of Huguenot invaders in 16th century Brazil to counter the accusations of nationalist and Catholic writers who depicted evangelical Christianity as an alien import, a misplaced religious expression foreign to Brazilian culture and traditions. The imagination of a deep Protestant past seemed to validate their evangelistic efforts in the 20th century. Furthermore, evangelical ministers such as Erasmo Braga and Eduardo Carlos Pereira appropriated certain tenets of Anglophone and European theology to take part in locally specific arguments on racial difference and social change. They channeled Protestant theology into debates circulating in the Brazilian public sphere, weaving together global and local religious and social discourses. Evangelicals penetrated the conceptual world of Brazilian society long before the rise of liberation theology and the integral mission in the context of the Cold War, connecting Protestant theology to the public life of the country. Thank you very much.